The Syrian Civil War wasn't just another conflict, it was a devastating and complex struggle that tore apart a nation and reshaped the geopolitical landscape of the Middle East. It was a brutal proxy war, fueled by global powers and their ambitions. Countries like the United States, Russia, Iran, and Turkey all had stakes in the outcome, each supporting different factions to further their own strategic interests. The war began in 2011, part of the Arab Spring uprisings sweeping across the Middle East and North Africa. These uprisings were driven by widespread discontent with authoritarian regimes, economic hardships, and a desire for greater political freedoms. Syrians, like others in the region, demanded change. They took to the streets in large numbers, calling for an end to corruption, repression, and the establishment of a more democratic society. They wanted more freedom and democracy. The initial protests were largely peaceful, with demonstrators holding signs and chanting slogans of hope and reform. They protested against the authoritarian rule of President Bashar al-Assad. Assad's family had been in power for decades, and many Syrians saw his regime as oppressive and out of touch with the needs of the people. Assad's government responded with force. Security forces were deployed to crack down on the protests, using tear gas, rubber bullets, and live ammunition to disperse the crowds. Peaceful protests were met with violence. The government's heavy-handed response only fueled the anger and determination of the demonstrators, leading to more clashes and a cycle of escalating violence. This ignited an armed rebellion against the Syrian government. Various opposition groups, including defectors from the Syrian army, began to organize and take up arms in an effort to overthrow Assad's regime. The country quickly descended into a bloody civil war. Cities and towns became battlefields, with neighborhoods being reduced to rubble and countless lives being lost in the crossfire. What started as a domestic struggle for political change soon became a complex web of international interests. Foreign powers saw the conflict as an opportunity to expand their influence and settle old scores. The Syrian conflict became a magnet for outside powers. Military interventions, arms supplies, and financial support from various countries turned the war into a proxy battleground. Each had their own agendas, often clashing with one another. The involvement of multiple actors with conflicting goals made the conflict even more intractable and prolonged. The war created fertile ground for extremist groups to thrive. Organizations like ISIS and al-Nusra Front exploited the chaos to gain territory and recruit fighters, further complicating the situation. The conflict's ripples were felt far beyond Syria's borders, impacting global security and triggering a refugee crisis. Millions of Syrians were displaced, seeking refuge in neighboring countries and beyond, creating one of the largest humanitarian crises of our time. The Syrian Civil War quickly became a global issue, drawing attention from around the world due to its devastating impact on civilians and the region's stability. Major powers like the United States and Russia saw an opportunity to advance their own interests, each seeking to expand their influence in the Middle East. These countries, along with regional players like Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey, were drawn into the conflict, each with their own strategic goals and alliances. They provided support to different sides in the war, supplying weapons, training, and financial aid to their chosen factions. The United States opposed Assad's government, condemning his regime for human rights abuses and calling for his removal from power. They supported what they saw as moderate rebel groups fighting against Assad, hoping to establish a more democratic government in Syria. Russia, on the other hand, was a longtime ally of Assad, viewing his regime as a key partner in the region and a counterbalance to US influence. They provided military support to his government, helping to tip the balance in his favor through airstrikes, ground troops, and logistical support. The involvement of these global players turned the Syrian conflict into a proxy war, with each side using the conflict to further their own geopolitical aims. A proxy war is a conflict where opposing sides use third parties as substitutes instead of fighting each other directly, often leading to prolonged and more complex conflicts. The US and Russia fought their geopolitical battles in Syria, using Syrian lives as pawns in a larger game. This not only prolonged the conflict but also increased the suffering of the Syrian people, as international interests overshadowed the quest for peace. The war led to one of the worst humanitarian crises in recent history, with millions of Syrians displaced, seeking refuge in neighboring countries and beyond. Despite numerous international summits and peace talks, a resolution remained elusive, as the interests of global and regional powers often clashed. The true cost of the conflict was borne by the Syrian people, whose lives were shattered by the ongoing violence and instability. As the world watched, the hope for a peaceful resolution and the rebuilding of Syria remained a distant dream, overshadowed by the complex web of international interests and alliances. The United States had multiple interests in Syria. Officially, the US government called for Assad to step down. They wanted to see a democratic government in Syria. They believed this would promote stability in the region. The US also aimed to weaken the influence of Iran in the region. Iran is a major ally of the Syrian government. The US saw the Syrian conflict as a way to counter Iran's growing influence in the Middle East. The US also wanted to prevent the spread of terrorism. The rise of extremist groups in Syria like ISIS alarmed US officials. They feared these groups would destabilize the region and potentially threaten US interests. Russia's interests in Syria were rooted in its long-standing alliance with the Assad family. Russia had maintained a naval base in Syria since the Soviet era. This base, in Tartus, gave Russia a strategic foothold in the Mediterranean Sea. Russia saw supporting Assad as a way to protect its interests in the region. Russia also wanted to project itself as a global power. By intervening in Syria, Russia showed its willingness to challenge the United States on the world stage. The Syrian conflict became an arena for Russia to assert its influence and challenge the US-led world order. Section 5. ISIS emerges, a common enemy, for a time. In the chaos of the Syrian Civil War, a new threat emerged: ISIS. The conflict, which began as a struggle between the Assad regime and various rebel groups, created a power vacuum that allowed extremist factions to gain a foothold. ISIS, or the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, was a jihadist group even more extreme than Al-Qaeda. They quickly gained notoriety for their brutal tactics and sophisticated propaganda, which they used to recruit fighters from around the world. ISIS took advantage of the power vacuum in Syria to seize territory and declare a so-called caliphate. They controlled large swaths of land, imposing their harsh interpretation of Islamic law on the local populations. The rise of ISIS complicated the Syrian conflict. It added another layer of violence and suffering to an already devastating war and drew in new international actors. The United States and Russia, despite their rivalry, both saw ISIS as a major threat. For a brief period, this common enemy brought them into a loose alignment, as both nations sought to curb the spread of ISIS. The US formed an international coalition to combat ISIS in Iraq and Syria. This coalition included a wide range of countries, each contributing in different ways to the fight against the jihadist group. Russia also launched airstrikes against ISIS targets in Syria. Their involvement was part of a broader strategy to support the Assad regime, but it also served to weaken ISIS's hold on the region. However, the fight against ISIS did not erase the fundamental differences between US and Russian goals in Syria. While both nations wanted to defeat ISIS, their broader objectives in the region remained at odds, leading to a complex and often contradictory set of alliances and conflicts. Section 6. Proxy warfare, supporting opposing sides. The US and Russia backed different sides in the Syrian Civil War. The US provided support to groups opposed to Assad's government. These groups were often referred to as moderate rebels. However, distinguishing between moderate and extremist groups in the Syrian conflict was a complex issue. Russia, on the other hand, provided unwavering support to the Syrian government. Russian airstrikes targeted rebel groups, including those backed by the US. This proxy warfare prolonged the conflict and made finding a peaceful solution even more difficult. Section 7. A devastated Syria, the human cost of war. The Syrian Civil War has been one of the deadliest conflicts of the 21st century. Hundreds of thousands of Syrians have been killed, millions more have been displaced, forced to flee their homes in search of safety. The war has created a humanitarian catastrophe. The Syrian people have endured unimaginable suffering. The war has destroyed infrastructure, crippled the economy, and left the country in ruins. The psychological scars of the conflict will likely take generations to heal. Section 8. The conflict today. A nation in ruins. The Syrian civil war is not over, though the intensity of the fighting has decreased. Bashar al-Assad remains in power, his grip on the country strengthened by Russian support. Large parts of Syria are controlled by various armed groups, including Kurdish forces and Turkish-backed rebels. The future of Syria remains uncertain. The country is fractured, its economy in shambles. The international community is struggling to find a political solution that can bring lasting peace to Syria. Section 9. Global Consequences. A new era of proxy wars. The Syrian Civil War has had far-reaching consequences. It has highlighted the dangers of proxy warfare in the 21st century. The conflict has also exacerbated tensions between the United States and Russia. The war in Syria has become a symbol of a new era of great power competition. The Syrian conflict has also had a profound impact on the Middle East. It has fueled sectarian tensions and created instability across the region. The war in Syria is a stark reminder of the human cost of conflict and the urgent need for peaceful solutions to international disputes.